This is Carbon Mike. Welcome to episode 1 of Flashpoints, a new podcast series devoted to current events with a focus on foreign policy and geopolitics. My co-host for Flashpoints is Jules, a consultant and strategic analyst from the UK. Our goal is to have interesting conversations that help people make sense of what's happening in the world. In this episode, recorded Tuesday, February 15th, 2022, we looked at Russia and Ukraine and the roots of the current crisis. Where to even start? I mean, with this, with this particular flashpoint. I mean, this trying to find people who are talking rationally about this.
Yeah.
Anywhere in the policy establishment that by itself seems almost impossible. Trying to find people who can stop frothing at the mouth for 5 seconds about Russian aggression and this and that and Putin's a very bad man and all this. But it's like, finding someone who can just think straight about all this. That's been the number one challenge for me, like wanting to talk to other people, and you're one of the people who seems to be able to think straight, who is able to think straight.
Well, I mean, it's kind of you to say so, but I have to say, I'm as mystified as you by what people are saying. So, on the one extreme, we've got this chairman, or at least member of the Defence Select Committee at Parliament, Tobias Ellwood, saying we should have NATO divisions in Ukraine. This is the only way to stop an invasion, and the consequences of that are, I mean, Ukraine hasn't asked for NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine.
Correct.
Because it knows what would happen. It knows what would happen.
Correct.
I mean, you see, what really freaks me out is that all the people making decisions have either forgotten or never knew because they're ignorant, and they shouldn't be in positions if they're ignorant about these things. What we found out about Russian plans for a land war in Europe after the Berlin Wall came down. And their plan was for a localized tactical nuclear exchange as the first action if they ever decided to head west. Okay, so Germany, so all the NATO forward forces, all the force concentrations. So in Germany we had three main defensive nodes: the North German Plain, the Fulda Gap on the Hof corridor. So they were all going to get hit. All the forward air base is going to get hit. The air defense, command and control infrastructure, everything was just going to get nuked with our nuclear artillery or short-range nuclear missiles or free-fall bombs, or whatever. But the point is, they were going to just nuke Germany. Okay, so that was everything. They weren't a dick about. They were going to nuke Germany, and they were then just going to go blast through that wreckage, because all Soviet armor is NBC hardened, so we're just going to go through that wreckage and basically evict US forces from surviving US forces from the European landmass. And this was going to be accompanied. You see, the thing to bear in mind, of course, is if you're on the receiving end of, let's say, a nuclear capable artillery shell, until it goes bang, you don't know what's in it.
Correct.
So it's not like they say, oh, they've launched a nuclear attack. No, they've simply launched an attack. By the time you find out it's nuclear and everything's being taken out emphatically and systematically, it's too late. You have no chance to respond unless you're going to go to an extra theater response. But what the Russians had planned to do was accompany it with a communique to say this is very localized, it's happening here, we're not going to expand it. If you want to expand it, if you want to take it outside this local area, we can do that, that's fine. But it will, of course, obviously enough, escalate into widespread annihilation of our respective populations. And let's face it, we don't want that.
Right.
So that's what they were going to do. So the idea that we would put divisions into Ukraine and not expect the whole place to get lit up is just ridiculous. I mean, it's just absurd. On the other hand, sensible people like Peter Hitchins are saying there is no Russian buildup on the border. Well, that's just simply not credible, because everybody knows they put vast numbers of troops there, and they're not even denying it. So, why say they're not there? That just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I hadn't caught the latest. I'd caught him saying that he doesn't think Russia wants to invade Ukraine. I hadn't caught him saying that there wasn't a buildup on the border yet. That it seems to me that it's pretty evident that there is. But
Yeah, this was this morning. He said, "Please, serious question. Can somebody please tell me where all these additional soldiers and armor are supposed to be? Because I've not seen any independent verification of this." I'm thinking, well, it really doesn't take long, and he had about 120 people replying with links saying, yeah." So
Interesting. Well, I'll give him. I'd like to give him the benefit of the doubt and say maybe he's talking about additional soldiers, because remember, when you and I had been talking about this, because this invasion has been imminent for more than a month, right? It's been imminent since before New Year's, right?
yeah,
And so when we last spoke about it, you had talked to me about Russian troop buildups and indications that they were moving some quantity of armored cavalry into position, and they had basically tactical controllers, and human resources to deconflict these large tank movements. Now that was a real buildup. I don't know if there has been a significant buildup since then, or if they've been merely shuffling their troops around. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, so what I've seen the main movement is additional forces being sent into Belarus for this big exercise
right
they've been having there. But I mean, it's in southern Belarus, so it's pretty close to Kiev, which is right at the north, as you know, of Ukraine.
Yes.
So it would make sense if they were going to go for some kind of a decapitation thing.
Right.
They've also put some additional paratroop type forces into the Crimea,
right.
Which is interesting. They haven't provided the airborne lift to take them anywhere, so they've just put them in there. I don't know why they've done that. So those are the two things. But I mean, as you know, as you've seen yourself, the Russian DEFMIN this morning reporting that they're cycling some troops back away from their border and returning to base because they've completed their exercise, and they accompany that with tanks going onto railroad cars to show that they're moving them. But I mean, we haven't seen which way they're moving yet.
Well, that's correct. And by the way, I remember getting a message from you a while ago. It may have been about a month ago, saying that with a similar communique from the Russian Defense Ministry that they were taking some number of men out of theater. I think I responded to you that, well, does anyone know who's in those personnel carriers? If anyone's in those personnel carriers, because that's certainly what I would do, right? I'd deploy my guys, and then I'd have a certain number of soft-sided vehicles, roll back the other way.
That's exactly what you said.
Right.
That's exactly what you said.
So to be fair to Hitchins, I think most of the men and material that Russia's got there built up, around the possible kill box and just east of the Dnieper River have probably been there for a while, and the narrative we're being sold is that there's this continuous buildup. Our leaders are poking Russia with a stick, and the media is poking us with a stick. Imminent invasion. Russia's moving troops, and it's like every day Russians moving huge numbers of troops. Well, they're not moving huge numbers of troops every day. Calm down, right? So I want to go back to something you said before, because one of the things that we're plagued with, right, is we have a foreign policy establishment that doesn't seem to know anything. It just seems to emote in public. It likes to feel things very, very visibly and melodramatically. And then we have a media establishment that doesn't want to know anything. Right? They are profoundly incurious.
Yeah.
And so the result, I think, is that we have a lot of people who don't necessarily geek out about this stuff like you and I do. They're at sea because they don't really know what to make of things, because no one's actually telling them anything that they can get a handle on. And I mean, that's one of the reasons why I jumped at it when you had the idea to do this Flashpoints podcast, because I just think people who care about this kind of stuff, and look, we are all people, we're citizens of our own countries, but we also live in the world. We should care about this kind of thing. We just, not enough people can even get enough to bring reason to bear on the situation, because no one seems to have any depth. No one seems to have any context on this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So what I'm just doing now is while you're speaking, I've just been I've just been pulling up a map. Okay, the cross-border railway map.
Mm.
And see if I can just see if I can send this to you. There you go. So this is a map of the Ukrainian railway network, okay? And you can see the connection nodes to the Russian Federation. Now, the reason this is interesting is because the Russians were saying that they're pulling these troops back, and they had these publicity shots of them, I say, being loaded onto railroad cars. But the thing is, if you want to get tanks quickly into a country, one really fast way of doing that for at least your reserve forces is to shove them on the railways. So if I was the Russians and I wanted to get tanks up to the Dnieper River pretty quickly, I'd do a number of things, but one of them is I would use the Ukraine network if I could do that.
Yes.
So just because they're moving stuff around, and they're not stupid. They know that we've got IR satellites looking at them, so they know that as soon as they start lighting up those tank engines, then the automatic pixel recognition or change recognition software is going to say, hang on a minute, we've got heat blooms in large numbers of engine spaces in right. Russian armored units, but so you're going to want a reason why that armor is moving, and right. to say, yeah, they're heading back over to the other side of the country would be a great one. Now, I'm not saying that's what they're doing. I'm just saying that just because you tell people you're moving things away, which, by the way, is what they did in 2014 before they went into Crimea, doesn't mean to say you're actually de-escalating. So
that's correct.
The one rational thing I've heard coming out of the powers that be in the West was NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, saying, well, we've heard what they've said, but we've not seen any tangible evidence of de-escalation yet. And I think what he was trying to say was, okay, they're moving some stuff around, but we're not going to prejudge that at this time, which is very smart of them, because it could be either way. And indeed, if you were going to mount a surprise attack, one of the best things you could possibly do is to say that you're sending stuff in the other direction.
That's correct.
So
that's correct.
So that's why following the data rather than getting excited is the right answer.
Right. Yeah. That's right. Follow the data. Follow the logistics. Right. That's the thing.
Yeah.
But again, going back to the thing, my recent obsession with utopian thinking,
yes.
as a kind of a love affair with nowhere, right? Nowhereanism.
Yes.
You've got to follow the terrain, right? You've got to follow the history. You've got to follow all those things that make any crisis, any confrontation, not just in a place, but of a place, right? This thing that's happening in Russia and Ukraine and is of that place. There's a reason it's happening. We've talked about it before. And people like to act as if Russia does not have a history, as if it doesn't have a near abroad that it's going to care about, as if only the U.S. gets to have a Monroe Doctrine, and Russia doesn't also have get to have a Monroe Doctrine for its local sphere of influence. And what I keep trying to tell people is, and you and I have talked about this, is like Ukraine plus Russian winters have destroyed 2 continental armies. Okay.
Yes.
It's a fearsome defense. They will pay almost any price to keep that from falling into the Western orbit. And it's that simple. So people can, I've had a lot of people become quite indignant with me and talk about how, well, they did this to this and they interfered with elections and they did this and they poisoned Sergei Skripal apparently and all this business. It's like, listen, let's leave all that to one side for a second, because it's really not, aside from being debatable, it's irrelevant.
It's irrelevant. Exactly.
Right. The question is, do you want to get in a shooting war with these guys? And the answer is no. That's it.
No, exactly. Because as a matter of simple fact, they're not militarily defeatable.
Correct.
And this is the difference that we had with Germany into the Second World War, is they were capable of being defeated. Whereas you can't do that with Russia. All you can do is everybody gets defeated. I mean, that's your ultimate end game. So you can't do it. So there is no point. The best and most important thing you can do is to help the Russians understand that there is no threat to them, and you do that by not doing the things that you said you weren't going to do. So we can wind it all the way back to the promise that NATO would not advance 1 inch towards Russia. Well, that's turned out well, because then we have the open door doctrine and yeah, sure, anybody can join NATO. Great, why not? So let's now reconstitute the Warsaw Pact and let's sign up Mexico. Let's see how that works.
How's that grab you?
Yeah, I mean it's literally like that, and wow.
Yeah.
And it's not like the Americans didn't get just slightly antsy about the whole Cuba thing.
Well, this is the thing. You see, this is why these nowhereans really I can't deal with them, because in historical terms, that happened 5 seconds ago, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he was ready to send Russian warships to the bottom because there were missiles in Cuba. Now, there are comparable distances involved when we're talking about having Ukraine join NATO and us being able to, just slide some anti-missile missiles into Ukraine, right? I mean, something you said, there was I can't pull it up now, I don't remember, but there was a press conference that Vladimir Putin did about this kind of NATO expansion and well, what's your problem if we're just putting anti-missile missiles in this place close to you, and what's the problem with cruise missiles? And he did that thing that Putin often does. You can tell he's exasperated, but he's posing his rhetoric in the form of questions, and it brought me in mind of what you were saying earlier about nuclear artillery. People think that nuclear weapons are somehow only ICBMs. But, there is such thing as a nuclear mortar. There's nuclear artillery and so on and so forth. There's nuclear cruise missiles, right? So, and that's what he said. Well, okay, things get hot in that part of the world. You start lobbing cruise missiles around. How do we know what's in them? How do we know what's in them? Do you know how dangerous this is? How much time do our missile commanders have to react when, a missile goes off course because you're doing something in this part of it? Do you have any idea how incredibly dangerous this is? And really, in retrospect, he's what he's kind of asking, that's his polite way of asking, listen, do you people want to get lit up? Is that what do you want cities to start disappearing off the face of the earth?
Yeah.
And people have to be very, even as the progressives have seemed to have taken over a lot of our culture and institutions, there's a regressive strain, as in regression to childhood, in a lot of the way we talk about foreign policy. I think I was saying to you earlier that a merely Machiavellian figure in this landscape would be an upgrade. Someone who understands what the state is for. What do you think that comes from? In other words, this way in which we seem to not even be able to talk about these kinds of things like adults. Where do you think that comes from?
I think it comes from fear is the first thing. I think it comes from in this specific case, fear of the unpredictability of the Biden administration. Are they going to hold the long-held American line, or are they not? So that's the first thing. This prompts the fear response in the British government of taking the toughest possible line to try and pull the Americans along, to try and put lead in the U.S. pencil. Did you hear about the call between Johnson and Biden yesterday?
I did not.
Okay. Johnson and Biden called yesterday. Johnson said to Biden, and I'm paraphrasing, he said, we're here, we're ready to take, there's a strong line on this in terms of imposing sanctions if Russia invades and maximizing the pain, all the usual sort of thing they were saying. Yeah. And Biden's response reportedly was, "Don't worry, pal, we're not going anywhere without you." And I thought it was a really interesting response on a number of levels, because for a start, it's precisely zero committal,
right,
as to what their intention is. Correct. And I think this since then, the British rhetoric has just wound up a further notch. You then had Boris's absolutely insane exhortation to the Europeans that we messaged about yesterday.
Oh
Him
yeah.
saying, "Yeah, take the Nord Stream out of your bloodstream."
Jesus.
This was the rhetoric he used. He said, "Unplug the."
Oh wait a minute. Wait a minute. I'm going to read the quote from the thing because you sent me the link. Let's see.
Yeah.
In a message to his European allies, Mr. Johnson said that the world needed to demonstrate the political and economic cost an invasion would have on Russia, including by ending reliance on its gas. Quote, "What I think all European countries need to do now is get Nord Stream out of the bloodstream. Quote, yank out that hypodermic drip feed of Russian hydrocarbons that is keeping so many European economies going."
Yeah, that's the one.
Jesus.
That's the one. So he's saying to them, we recognize that your economies are reliant on Russian hydrocarbons.
Right.
Nevertheless, turn off the tap. Okay. So if you're a patient, let's just work with the analogy that he has given us. Okay, the imagery from Johnson. You're a patient and you're being transfused, okay, with vital, life-saving drugs. Are you going to pull the plug? Is that really what you're going to do?
Well, if you're Boris Johnson, hell yeah, that's what you do. You know, let's get rid of all this. And by the way, if you're getting a blood transfusion, yeah, pull that too. You know why? And
yeah,
and
exactly.
by the way, unplug that pesky dialysis machine. I mean, but this is what I mean. I mean, this is you think about. I mean, I know, you know, in this podcast, we talked about really focusing on the events themselves, but the extent to which the rot has spread. I mean, when a man like this, who was educated in some of the finest schools your country has to offer.
I know.
This is pathetic. Aside from being, you know, it's got to be kind of nerve-wracking to actual Europeans looking at this guy and saying that, you know, what is he saying?
Yeah.
It's when that's the level of analysis, when that's the level of thought. I mean, we have a much more serious. In other words, Russia is nowhere near our biggest problem. You know, it's like we're our biggest problem.
No, we fully are. And what's absolutely staggering to me is that there's no attempt by Johnson to say that he's in it with the Europeans.
Right.
He's asking them to make the sacrifice.
Correct.
And in particular Germany, and this of course was timed for the shuttle diplomacy of Scholz to Kiev and Russia, at which I fully expect Scholz to have said to Kiev, look, you guys have just got to say that you won't join NATO. If you don't, we will have to say to the Russians that we'll veto you joining NATO. But we're not going to do is nothing, have a war, you guys get wiped out. The whole thing's just crazy.
Right.
Absolutely crazy.
Right. Yeah, fundamentally, what we're seeing is the culmination of years and years. I think you'd agree with this. I'd like to get your take on this. But it seems to me that this conflict, this wholly avoidable conflict, is the result of decades of foreign policy drift. I have, you know, particular ideas about why we've been drifting. It may be that drift we've experienced in foreign policy and in military affairs may be downstream from cultural drift, from us being eradicated, uprooted culturally and socially and all this business. But it seems to me that we've been drifting since the end of the Cold War. What's your take on that? I mean,
so I think that is exactly what it was. There was a mindset at the end of the Cold War that we had the end of history, that the single defining struggle that would color everything that happened in the years going forward has now finished. There now will be no intercontinental nuclear exchange. The Russians have been defeated, and what will happen is that democracy will spread ever further eastwards, and indeed, you know, around the world generally. This has been this massive complacency on the part of the West to fail to look to its laurels. And it was like, okay, we've won. Now we can all take it easy and just go make some money. And then we had various uncomfortable things happening, which for some reason didn't shake that narrative, be it the rise of also almost state level Islamic terrorism, and certainly, able to challenge our ability to defend ourselves. Witness, of course, 9/11 as a paradigm example, or the paradigm example of that. And despite all of this, I think we almost felt we were dealing with a sequence of individual problems, which is why we hopped from country to country to country, trying to fix them, rather than taking a step back and looking at it in a more holistic way to say, actually, has history now finished? What is really going on here? And does everybody agree with us that history has finished? Because if they don't, if there's still other people out there making their own history at our expense, then maybe we need to be responsive to that.
Yes.
And of course, into that vacuum is precisely where Putin has stepped.
Yes.
And he does not follow Gorbachev's lead by any measure.
Yes.
That the solution to the collapse of the Soviet bloc regime is to westernize Russia. I think he sees himself as the Tsar. I think he sees himself having reset the clock back to Tsarist Russia. He is effectively the Tsar, and he wants to go back to that period and simply say, well, communism was a wrong turn, had lots of bad effects, but we are where we are now. Let's go back to how we used to govern, because that worked pretty well. I think that's where he is. So I think to this extent, my friend, we're back to that term again. I think he's as much of a destinarian as Johnson is.
Interesting.
There's a scary thought.
Interesting. I would say I see why you say that. I'd take a slightly different line. And indulge me for a bit. I'd like to get your take on this. But it seems to me that usually people who are wrapped up in these great visions, right? Especially visions about themselves and this is kind of manifest destiny type people. They pay less attention to the fundamentals than one would like, right? And so the one thing is, for example, I've noticed for as long as Vladimir Putin has been the leader of Russia, the fundamentals of the Russian economy look very good. Their debt to GDP ratio is very good. They have a very small economy. That's true. Okay, they're not. It's not huge, but they've got a healthy domestic manufacturing sector. They seem to be able to innovate pretty decently in military. They seem to be able to flip hardware and come out with new tank designs and aircraft designs pretty well. In fact, you could argue at a higher tempo and at a lower cost than we do. I'm looking at you, Joint Strike Fighter. You pig.
Exactly. And they've, their military innovation in the last few years, when it started, it was dismissed as, but they haven't actually got any of this stuff working. They're just paper designs.
Yes.
Well, actually, now we see them testing their hypersonic missiles.
Correct. And
now we see that their Armata tank does, in fact, have an anti-missile defense capability. Mm-hmm. And they have got the Poseidon tsunami-generating autonomous nuclear submarine to all intents and purposes. Mm-hmm. So all the things that they said they had and they were doing, it turns out actually, they do have them and they can do them. So that's quite astonishing. They are now ahead militarily.
Well, and by the way, unlike us, they also seem to be able to see a good design in a piece of hardware, military hardware, and more or less stay with it and kind of update it, but not toss it in the trash every few years because someone got lobbied by a defense contractor with a shiny new thing.
They don't have those vulnerabilities.
They don't have those vulnerabilities. They seem to be. Speaking of tanks, I think it looked to me as if they've one of their tank lines has upgraded its reactive armor. So it's like a second generation reactive armor for these, or a third generation for these tanks. And so jumping back to the thing about Putin and Russia, it seems to me that, again, the economic fundamentals are good. People complain, Vladimir Putin is a kleptocrat. He's just there enriching himself, and that's what he's doing, and he's corrupt, and he's got 10 houses. And I don't know how many houses he has. I have no idea. But the point I come to is that when you look at the way kleptocrats typically govern, this is not it. Usually what they do is let's assume that everyone's locking up dissidents, because everyone is locking up dissidents. I mean, don't tell me about Putin locking up dissidents until we talk about Justin Trudeau trying to freeze truckers' bank accounts and take away their property. I don't want to hear it.
I know.
Okay? So going back to Putin, it seems to me that when a merely corrupt strongman takes office, what does he do? He turns the mint into a printing press. He turns the government into a hiring hall. He stuffs all the important government posts with all his buddies who just, kind of snuffle up all the money that's meant for everything else.
You basically just defined the Johnson regime.
There you go.
You have. That's exactly what you just described. Wow.
Well, they always project, don't they? Right. So this is the thing. It doesn't seem like Putin has done any of that, and that's why the fundamentals of his economy are so good. That his debt is under control.
He's got a budget
and he
surplus,
can pay.
For God's sake.
Exactly.
He's running a budget surplus.
He's running a surplus. And he can actually afford to pay people in the Russian diaspora to come back to Russia and settle down and build a home and have babies. Now, it seems to me that the big thing about Russia, to the extent that Putin has a big plan, it's really a negative plan. What I mean by that is that his one real objective for Russia is to have it soundly reject the Western consensus as far as economic neoliberalism. Like, I don't know what he actively plans for Russia, what he positively plans for Russia, but I seem to get a very clear sense of what he does not want for Russia, what he has soundly rejected. And that's this idea that once your government collapses, as theirs did, right, at the end of the Cold War, the Western powers will come in and will liberalize the economy, and a bunch of rich guys will come up and buy buy up all the state resources and privatize everything. And they'll go down that, classic kind of, what would they call it? The Chicago School, Washington Consensus, whatever they call it, economic shock therapy, shock treatment, whatever. And that was gonna be the script. And the thing I keep coming back to is this. Let's think about ammunition for a second, going lateral on this topic. So over there, you guys shoot 7.62 NATO rounds in your rifles, or a 308. As we call the 308, 30 caliber, 38 Winchester. We don't use the metric system because we're not sissies. And so you take a standard NATO cartridge. What is the heaviest component of an ammunition cartridge? Well, it's the actual bullet, right? It's the actual projectile. Okay. So the most massive, the heaviest part of your cartridge is your bullet. And then you have, of course, the brass casing, and you have the primer, and you have the propellant. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that's nowhere near the most expensive part of a cartridge. The most expensive part of an ammunition cartridge is the brass casing. Right? It's not the primer, it's not the propellant, certainly, and it's not the bullet. It's the cartridge, the brass casing is very, very, very light compared to the actual copper jacketed round, right?
Yeah.
Now that's odd, right? There's almost, compared to the amount of material that's in the bullet, there's almost nothing in the brass case. But it's the most expensive. Why? Because of value add. It takes a lot of inputs to manufacture brass shell casings. And that's the magic of value-added economies. Russia is interested, and Putin is interested in making Russia a value-added economy and not an extractive economy, as the Western powers would have liked it to become after the Soviet Union collapsed. It is the curse of resource-rich, weak countries all around the world that the Western powers come and say, hey, would you like some loans? Would you like some money? Would you like to just follow this handy recipe book about how to modernize your economy? And no problem. And next thing you know, they've turned these guys into a purely extractive economy, never being able to turn to kind of level up and become value-added economies. And it seems to me that Russia has successfully resisted that program, and he has turned Russia into a country that is at least capable of holding its own as a value-added economy. Now, that was an awfully long rant. I want to shut up and get
No,
your
no,
take
no,
on
no,
it.
no.
But yeah.
That's not a perspective that I'd considered previously. I mean, I've been also looking at the Russian economy point of view, because one of the ways in which Putin has been so clever, and this goes directly to what you've just been saying, but I looked at it from a slightly different perspective, is that if you're looking to defend yourself against an attack, the first thing you need to do is to itemize and understand the nature of that attack, and then you can build an appropriate defense.
Yes, sir.
So the military example of this would be, okay, we're worried about incoming missiles, therefore we'll build an anti-missile defense system. We'll build Patriot and Iron Dome if you're the Israelis or whatever. Okay. So what is the first strike weapon of the democratic, formerly democratic Western nations against actions they don't like by countries such as Russia or, for example, Iran or whatever? That is the use of sanctions. Okay, right. So how do you defend yourself against sanctions? What does sanctions do to your economy, and how can you re-engineer and reimagine your economy to make them, as far as one can, sanctions proof? And right. he spent the last 10 years doing that. So they've got massive foreign currency reserves. They're not reliant on Western imports of technology, or to the least possible that they can get away with. They're self-sufficient. They're developing alternative routes for selling the things that they make or create or extract or whatever it happens to be, namely the Asian raw materials market. They've got Russia has got their back as far as that goes. As much hydrocarbons as they can get out of the ground. China, forgive me. China will take from them, and they've got other regimes they do business with as well. So Putin has spent a long time creating a virtually sanctions-proof economy, a part of which is precisely the effect you have just recognized, so that he can then say, my foreign policy objective of stopping Ukraine joining NATO by whatever means I have to do that is not going to be derailed because I'm frightened of a sanctions-based counterattack.
Correct. That's exactly it. And by the way, I'll turn your attention to kind of the someone who has followed the opposite principle, someone who was really a kleptocrat and really did just seem to enrich himself and aggrandize himself at his country's expense, and not build out his infrastructure. The late Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe. I specifically go to Zimbabwe because, one, it's a country that's on a giant landmass, and two, it's a very resource-rich country. That's why the Imperial West was interested in the first place and went down there and put down sticks there. Okay, yep. Now yep. Robert Mugabe had, in my way of thinking, did have a legitimate grievance with Western powers as far as restitution for stolen property, let's say. Okay, he did have a legitimate grievance, but what he did not do was take the time to build his economy, to build local industries and local knowledge centers and enough internal economic combat mass to successfully resist sanctions. And I remember when Zimbabwe began its kind of downward spiral, I remember I had a lot of arguments with people who I knew who were on the left. And they were indignant about the wrong thing, it seemed to me. They were like, well, the Western powers have done this and this to Zimbabwe, and look at what they do to African countries. And I was like, all that is true. Yeah, I take all that on board. Certainly. Of course. But the point is that how you react to that matters. This is chess. It's not checkers. He did not make his economy sanctions-proof. So what happened?
Exactly.
He started to get frisky with the Western powers, and they flipped a switch and crashed his economy.
Yep.
Almost instantly. Zimbabwe went from being the breadbasket of Southern Africa, okay, to being an economic basket case. Okay?
Exactly.
And I remember this was part of my journey away from the left, right? Because being a technical guy, being an engineering guy and being a geek, I was always saying to people, listen, how come we don't have in the third world and in places where a lot of my friends come from and, a lot of my predecessors come from, why are we always waving some stupid little red book around and talking all this noise about how we're going to do this and that, and you're holding your little AK-47s up in the air, and it's like, why are we not actually building internal structures and local expertise and a manufacturing base so we can actually stand up to Western sanctions? Then we want to complain that the dead hand of European imperialism is doing this and that, the other. But it seems to me that certainly we have a shining example in the figure of Vladimir Putin, is that this is what he's done. He said, no, we are not going to be a client state. We're going to be a value add economy. We're not just going to suck these natural resources out of the ground and just sell them to you for cash. We're not going to privatize national resources that are worth billions and billions of dollars. We're going to use these things to enhance the prosperity of the Russian state. And again, people say, oh, well, he's just using it to enrich himself. Maybe he is a rich guy. I have no idea. But the fact is that, again, a merely kleptocratic leader, someone who was just getting paid behind this, wouldn't have taken such good care of the fundamentals, and he would have crashed his own kind of logo. Yeah.
You're right. I think that I certainly look at Putin and I see somebody who's got a lot of things going on in terms of his worldview. You know, the Russians are notoriously complex.
Yes, sir.
People. They're notoriously complex people, and he's got a lot of things going on. I mean, I think I may have tweeted about this. I just learned yesterday, his elder brother died during the siege of Leningrad.
Wow.
You put that in somebody's backstory, that's going to have an effect.
Yes,
it
sir.
really is going to have an effect, and you learn a lot about life if that sort of shit happens to you. So yeah. He's got a remarkable career. He's complicated even for a Russian. So I'm not pretending to understand everything about him. That would be arrogant and foolish. But what I would say is I generally don't detect somebody who, as you say, is simply just enriching himself at the expense of his people. I detect somebody who is doing what he thinks is right for a country that he passionately loves and believes in.
Right.
And he's trying to put it on a track that will be durable for generations after he has gone. That's what I think, regardless if he's right or not. I mean, we can't. History will judge him ultimately, not us. But I think that is his primary motivation.
That's correct. And by the way, it's something you said a couple of conversations ago, the idea that Putin would have read, I think it was, you mentioned Hopkirk's The Great Game.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that Putin would have been steeped in the literature and the history and the military and political philosophy of Europe in the era of the Great Game. He would have soaked this stuff. He would have absorbed it through his skin, right? And that he moves and he acts and he seems to reason like someone who gets this stuff cold.
Absolutely. And if you look at the If you look at the source material that Hopkirk used for the Great Game, some of it is material that is in the library of the Russian General Staff. So, for example, some of the Russian players they kept detailed journals and or wrote autobiographies and stuff, and that stuff was within the Russian General Staff library. It's the same thing that we'd see. I don't know, Duke of Wellington's memoirs at the Sandhurst Library. They reference this stuff, and they will know it. And his the occupation, the bloodless occupation of Crimea was an absolute textbook play that they used on at least 2 occasions during the Great Game era to take over city-states known as khanates. To take over these non-aligned city-states, having said they were going to not advance any closer to British interests, which at that time were Afghanistan and India as it was then. And they said that they had no intentions to start crossing the 2,000 miles that separated the Tsarist Empire with the Victorian England Empire. No, Victorian British Empire, excuse me. No desires at all. And then it was, we just had to go and pacify this one particular incarnate. It's unfortunate. We'll be there for the least possible time, and we'll be out of there. Of course, they never left. Having first denied they were going to do it, then they said they weren't going to do it. Then they said, actually, well, we did do it. It's temporary, but then they just stayed. And they did that twice, and they just used exactly the same play in Crimea. It's just fantastic to read. It really is.
Yeah. It's interesting to me. Talking to you is always a pleasure. There's a lot of depth that is possible to get just by kind of slowing down and thinking these things through and applying a little bit of historical knowledge. I mean, you've been looking at this stuff for a long time. You've been reading about it, writing about it, thinking about it. But not everyone has to necessarily spend all that time reading and writing and thinking about this particular topic. To break out of the excuse for thought and the excuse for analysis that we get from legacy media, what would be a good layman's primer, right, for someone who is looking at the mainstream media talk about this stuff, looking at our leaders talk about this stuff, and someone who's beginning to suspect that these guys are not playing it straight. What's really going on here, right? So someone who's not necessarily a history geek, but someone who wants to dig a little bit deeper. Like, do you have any recommendations in terms of reading material, websites, what have you?
This is a great question. It's also one of the most difficult things to answer, because
yes, sir.
some of the places you might thought you could go for that slightly better analysis, you find you simply can't go to because they're just absolutely yapping at the wrong tree.
Yes.
I mean, my God, The Economist, for example, has recently just unbelievable. And what was the other one? Oh God, The Hill. Was it The Hill yesterday? Let me see if I can find it.
Oh God.
Let me just see if I can find this, because it was the most incredible thing. Just bear with me. I'm just looking at my other screen while we do this, because it might be worth having be finding it. But it was just literally 180 degrees wrong. But the trouble is, they're prolific tweeting organizations, so they're always tweeting.
You didn't even give them credit for being a news organization. They're a tweeting organization.
Yeah, they're just well, that's what I'm saying. They're yapping.
Right.
They're yapping up the wrong tree. It was an opinion piece. Here we go. I found it. The Hill. Putin's Ukraine gambit unites Western democracies he sought to divide. That's just not what's been happening. I mean, it's unbelievably wrong. It's 180 degrees backwards. I mean, Johnson may well have de facto destroyed NATO with his comments about Germany should sacrifice its economy to preserve NATO's open door policy. How could The Hill get it so wrong? I mean, it's just astonishing. But so the Daily Telegraph has got some columnists who have thought deeply about these things and who are not overreacting. It also publishes pieces by Tobias Ellwood calling for divisions in Ukraine. So you've got to apply a filter.
That's right.
But it does have some good people and some good analysts. Yeah. But what I would always suggest, to go back to your question, if people really want to understand what's happening in any given geopolitical sense, is first have a basic idea of history.
That's correct. That's
your starting point.
That's where
know that Napoleon tried to invade and conquer Russia. Know that Hitler tried to do it. Look what happened to those two invading armies, as you were saying earlier. Look why they both foundered in the morass of the Ukrainian winter.
Correct. And
then you understand the buffer policy. And the rest is very simple, actually very simple. Right. But it's also the case that Russia clearly doesn't want to spend the blood of its youth conquering Ukraine.
Right.
It's never wanted to do this. It just feels pushed into, if necessary, doing it. And I still don't think it will. Within 24 hours, I could like a total knob. But I still don't think it will, because I think the pressure it's brought to bear is such that France and Germany have folded and have said, look, whatever you need, we'll give it to you. Just don't do this.
Right. Well, I mean, again, they will get it in the neck first if things get hot over there. So it's clear they don't
Yes.
want it. I'm glad you said what you said about history. I think that's crucial. I'm curious if you'd agree, but I would say that if someone's trying to get a baseline understanding of things, if they're looking at European, Russian foreign policy, so on and so forth. I mean, I think you could do a lot worse than Barbara Tuchman and the Guns of August and the Proud Tower.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So maybe even the Proud Tower first, because the Guns of August is really about the kind of the slow walk into war, into World War I, right, across Europe. But this kind of, as you were speaking about, Tsarist Russia and the Great Game and things like that, the Proud Tower is a pretty good book as well. And by the way, and for people who, the good news is that the age in which we live, it's possible to get a lot of these things on audiobook. So
go for a drive.
So
pump out some carbon. Help the planet by increasing atmospheric CO2, which the plants need.
Exactly, making plants grow better and go for a drive or what have you. Do whatever you feel, but get that on audiobook and listen to it. And I think that's that might be a very good way for people to get their bearings, okay, in terms of what's been happening, in on that landmass in the last century or so.
Yeah, and we go back to the root of the European Union and the root of NATO, which is the same place.
Yes.
By the way.
Yes.
Winston Churchill, and his concept for NATO, famously, he summarized as to keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out. Those were the three objectives he saw for NATO, but that was as conceived then.
Right.
And it's that expansion since 1990 that is what has brought us to this moment. And honestly, has that eastward expansion furthered the aims that was originally set for NATO as a security organization to preserve peace in the main part of Europe? And I think within 24 hours, maybe from the sound of it, or maybe a little bit longer, certainly within a month, we'll know. Yes. Whether that eastward expansion has furthered the key objective of NATO, preserving peace in Europe, or not. I fear that it hasn't, which is why Putin has acted as he has, and he has drawn a line, which I suspect they will make sure he doesn't cross. But as I say, I could be about to be made look very, very foolish when I say that I don't think he's going to do it. Yeah. I don't think he needs to now. I think he's probably been given what he needs by back channels. That's my. Else, why would Olaf Scholz go to Kiev and Moscow? What could he possibly gain?
Right.
Unless he's taking an offer.
Exactly. I think that's a good place to round this out. As you were speaking, I was thinking of a quote I like from. I can never remember which one of Queen Victoria's ministers this was. But it was a minister who was explaining some matter of policy to her and talking about the kind of shifting sands of allegiances and people who were, bordering on hostile today, who were friendly yesterday. And she asked him, well, don't we have any permanent friends? And he said, no, ma'am, no permanent friends and no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And I think that's a good lesson or a good quote or a good thing to internalize for us to think about as we try to get a handle of what's going on in the world. People, there's very much a team's culturally now. We have very much a team sports feeling about everything. And you've noticed this. I've noticed this. You look on social media, right? Everyone's frantically proclaiming what team they're on. And they're not really trying to make sense of things. They're just blurting things out. Most of us would, I think, do ourselves a great favor if we realize that we don't have a permanent friend. Certainly people in my country should realize, everyone of every political stripe should realize that we have no permanent friends in Washington. The British people have no permanent friends in Number 10 Downing or in Westminster Abbey in the Houses of Parliament. Okay, they own the people themselves only have permanent interests. And to the extent that we start to understand a little bit of history, get a little bit of context, take a deep breath and step back from the kind of hysterical posturing and bloviating and what have you of media types and government types. The more we can do that, and the sooner we do it, the better for all of us. So
100%. And thank you for just using one of my favorite words, bloviating. Magnificent. I love that word. Let us, you and I, never be accused of bloviating.
That's right. Well, thank you, brother. I appreciate you joining me for this thing.
And we will do this again soon for another conversation in Flashpoints.
Excellent. Thanks, man. Take care.
Take care, my friend. Bye now.